come around here to the Rocks. The Rocks in Sydney is an incredible story. It starts off with a place for the Marines to build some barracks, and for the husbands and the wives of the Marines to actually move in and build some homes. And the convicts were allowed to build their own houses or their own huts, and that was up behind where we were at Circular Quay. But over here they started to cut the sandstone and to make some really tremendous buildings that are still standing. But the Rocks developed this really incredibly bad reputation because it was a place where not only the Marines continued to drink, but was all sorts of other shenanigans that went on. And it was a common story where men were shanghaied, put down through the tunnels from one of the hotels just up the back here like the Lord Nelson, and put on a ship and taken to sea to work until they sort of sobered up or they could get off them. So this place was bad enough as it was, but after Phillip left, the fellows that came along as governors and in charge of the Marines just couldn't handle them. And it wasn't until about 1804 where MacArthur, remember him, he was into sheep? Well, MacArthur got himself into trouble because he had allowed a convict to stow away on one of his ships that left the harbour. And so because he had a part share in the ship, he had to pay a fine. Well, he wasn't going to pay a fine. I mean, I know that some people have a really bad attitude when it comes to paying up money when they should, but he was one of those that didn't want to pay his fine. Anyway, he was in trouble with the court and they arrested him and put him in the jail just up here at the Rocks. Well, he convinced his Marine friends that this was bad, it was the governor's fault, that this sort of injustice was against all principles of freedom and British rights. So they stormed up the hill to where the governor's house was, on the other side over there, park you can see, and they took hold of the governor's house. This was mutiny, this was tyranny. In fact, it was it was an affront to the king himself. So they arrested the governor and put him on a ship and sent him down to Tasmania. Well, it was only the Marines that now ran this place. Well, they gave themselves land and they imported rum. This place was so bad, it had put a pirate settlement to shame. It was just horrendous. And in the midst of all of that, I'll tell you a story about some of the people that lived here. There was this guy called George Cribb. Now, George had been arrested in England because he was a young fellow at 24, but he owned a butcher shop. And he had some people working for him because they were out stealing animals. And he was in trouble because he was cutting up horse meat and selling it in his butcher shop, which the judge really wasn't terribly impressed with. So he was sentenced to actually transportation, and he and his friends were supposed to and did come out to Australia. But what was missing is that the historians didn't notice that he was in court again the following week. This time it was because he had been forging pound notes, and he was in trouble for forging, and so was his girlfriend, who was pretending to be his wife, for forging and passing this money. So when George actually arrived in Sydney, he then bought an acre of land here at the Rocks. He then set up an animal yard and a slaughterhouse. He rented a house here in Gloucester Street. He was having a house built, and he was also having a pub built. So when Fanny arrived, the woman who was pretending to be his wife, George, of course, never spent a day in prison because he had a trade as a butcher. He was given a ticket to leave. So when Fanny arrived, when the guard came along and said name, she said, "Fanny Cribb." "Oh, Fanny, George is here waiting for you with a carriage to take you home." And she couldn't believe that for 14 years meant absolutely nothing here in Sydney. And so she began a life with George in the Rocks. So he was here when all of this shenanigans was going on with the Marines. Made a lot of money. He was doing really well. And anyway, he decided that he needed to marry Fanny. The problem was that it wasn't too long after that his real wife, Mary, got word in England how successful he was. And so she wrote a letter. "Dear George, I miss you so much. I'm coming to Australia to live with you." Well, Fanny and George freaked out. She needed to leave. He gave her the equivalent of $300,000 to get on a boat and leave. When I went and looked up how she left, I discovered that Mary came in on this particular boat. And a week later, Fanny left on the same boat. So he had to hide her somewhere before he could put her on the boat. So there George was, standing on the dock just like this, saying, "Oh, Fanny, the love of my life, I'm going to miss you, darling. Oh, all right. Bye, darling." And then, "Oh, Mary, how I've missed you so much. It is so good that you're finally here in Sydney." The bit that troubled me was I just couldn't discover what he said to the neighbours. But there he was, this fellow, who made up the characters of this incredible place called the Rocks. Now, what we don't realise is that Aborigines were also living here at the Rocks. And behind us, as you can see, is this phenomenal building called the Opera House, but it's built at Bennelong Point. Now, Bennelong was actually a friend of the governor, and it's a really fascinating story about how this friendship developed. There was a whale that washed up on the beach over at Manly, and Bennelong was over there. He saw the meat and he sent a word back to Philip to come and share in the meat. So Philip arrived in a boat, and he got out of the boat and he was saying hello and he was meeting everybody, and there was an older man who hadn't seen Philip before. And Philip decided he would say hello, and he smiled and showed that he didn't have a tooth, of course, but he put out his hands, and for some reason the old fella took that as a sign of, as a threat, picked up his spear, threw it at Philip, and it went through his shoulder. Well, Philip was severely hurt. There was all sorts of commotion. People ran off in all directions. Men were back in the boat, taking Philip across to this side to the surgeon, whose name was Balmain. Balmain put everybody else out of the hospital and operated to get the spear out of his shoulder. And Philip did really think that he was going to die. Several months later, Bennelong came to see Philip, and he said, "We found the old man that threw the spear at you, and my mate and I were going to go out and kill him." And Philip said, "No, there's to be no revenge killing. I forgive the man for what he did to me." Now, Bennelong was in shock, because the natural way of living in the bush and just survival of the fittest and hunters and gatherers, his life had no value. And for Philip to say to him, "I forgive this man," was a concept that he'd never heard of before. Anyway, he went away and he thought about that, and within weeks he was back with his tribe and wanted to move into the colony, and that's when the free intercourse of the Aborigines coming and going started, but they had to leave the spears at the gate, was the only thing that was required of them. But from that point on, as the Aborigines started to live amongst them, there was a Spanish sea captain came through around about, I think it was about 1790, and in his diary, which has only recently been translated to English, he says, "When I pulled into Sydney, I couldn't believe it. I walked up the streets to the governor's house to have a lunch with him, and there were children, Caucasian and Aboriginal, playing together on the streets. And when I sat down to lunch with the governor, there were Aborigines sitting beside me." He said, "This is the most integrated place I've come across in the world." There was a fellow by the name of Bungaree, and Bungaree was a fellow that was actually the chief of the people from the Hawkesbury River up at Broken Bay. And he came down on a number of instances and started to integrate with the people here. He learned English, and he became famous because he had managed to get 17 officers' uniforms. And when the boats would pull in, like this one, he would actually be on the dock in one of these uniforms, and he'd walk up and down and take off the governor and speak in broad English and welcome all the tourists, the visitors, as they arrived. And I'm sure, as I read about him, I thought, well, he's just probably Australia's first tourist guide, showing people how the colony actually existed. Well, this man was not only good with his English and lived among the people, but a little later on, when Matthew Flinders was commissioned to sail around the entire continent and to map it, he took Bungaree with him. So while Flinders was the captain that was the first Caucasian to sail around the nation, Bungaree became the first Aborigine to actually join him on that trip. And we've sort of forgotten how integrated the Aboriginal society was at that time. Bungaree went on to have actually a farm, and Macquarie talks about him, and he gave him actually a badge, a metal thing to wear around his neck that proclaimed him to be the chief of the Broken Bay tribe. So here he was living in Sydney, and I came across something in Macquarie's diary where his wife says, "Oh, we need to go up and visit Bungaree and take him some pigs and some horses up the Georges River." So here he was with a farm. And in other diary notes, I found David Collins talking about young Aborigines working on the farms and working beside the convicts and getting paid for their labour. So we sort of forget about how successful this colony was in its integration, because it was really only a small pin dot of a place compared to the whole nation. But I mean, it was not only Philip that became a hero, as it were, or a leader to this great country because of him establishing this colony and what he did in trying to institute those precepts of the letters patent, but it was because he actually caught the vision of what this place could become, and he started to allow people to have dignity in their lives again and to find value in their lives and to take hold of that second chance that they were being given. The other great leader that is significant at this period is Colonel Lachlan Macquarie. Let's go look at Lachlan Macquarie.